It was a typical afternoon in the bustling city. The streets buzzed with the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of car engines, and the occasional laughter of a group of teenage boys. They wandered aimlessly, looking for a way to pass the time, their mischievous grins hinting at trouble. In the corner of the park, a man sat alone on a worn bench. His clothes were ragged, his face weathered by years of hardship, but his eyes held a quiet strength, a glimmer of dignity that hadn't been broken by his circumstances. He had become a familiar sight to the locals, often ignored, sometimes pitied, but never truly seen. "Hey, look who's here," one of the boys said, nudging his friends. They snickered as they approached the man, their laughter carrying across the park. What started as a few taunts quickly escalated, cruel jokes, mocking gestures, and sneers that drew the attention of passers-by. Most people turned a blind eye, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. But karma has a way of balancing the scales, and what the boys didn't realize was that their actions would set off a chain of events they couldn't control. Within days, the tables would turn, and the same man they had tormented would become the center of a story they'd never forget. They thought they could get away with mocking him, but what happened next turned their world upside down. The group of boys was inseparable, their laughter and antics filling the streets as they moved from one mischief to the next. At the center of the group was Dylan, the self-proclaimed leader. With his sharp tongue and confident swagger, Dylan was the kind of boy who thrived on attention and had a knack for pushing things too far. Beside him was Jake, his loyal follower, always eager to impress Dylan no matter the cost. Then there was Eric, the reluctant participant, who often cast uneasy glances but rarely spoke up, too afraid of becoming the group's next target. On the other side of the city, the homeless man, Mr. Carter, led a quiet, solitary existence. In his early 60s, he had a wiry frame, a graying beard, and kind eyes that carried a lifetime of stories. Once a teacher, Mr. Carter had lost everything after a series of unfortunate events, first his job, then his home, and eventually the connections that tethered him to a stable life. Despite his circumstances, he held himself with quiet dignity, spending his days reading discarded newspapers and sketching scenes of the city on scraps of paper he found. The first encounter between the boys and Mr. Carter happened on a breezy Saturday afternoon. The park was buzzing with activity, families picnicking, kids playing, and joggers passing by. Mr. Carter sat on his usual bench near the fountain, sketching a young girl chasing a butterfly. His pencil moved with practiced precision, capturing the joy of the moment despite the noise around him. "Check this out," Dylan said, spotting Mr. Carter from across the park. A smirk spread across his face as he nudged Jake. "Let's see what the old guy's up to." The group approached, their footsteps heavy with mischief. "Hey, what's that?" Dylan asked, snatching the sketch from Mr. Carter's hands before he could react. The man looked up, startled but calm, his eyes meeting Dylan's with a quiet strength. "That's mine," Mr. Carter said firmly but without aggression. Dylan waved the sketch in the air, laughing. "Looks like trash to me." Jake joined in, mimicking Dylan's laughter while Eric stood off to the side, shifting uncomfortably. "Come on, Dylan. Let's go," Eric muttered, but his words were drowned out by the taunts. The scene drew a few glances from passers-by, but no one stepped in to intervene. Mr. Carter sat silently, his expression unchanged as the boys jeered at him. "What's the matter, old man? Got nothing to say?" Dylan sneered, tossing the sketch to the ground. Mr. Carter leaned down, picking it up carefully, brushing off the dirt. "You should be careful how you treat others," he said softly, his voice steady. "Karma has a way of coming back around." The boys laughed harder, mocking his words as they walked away, leaving Mr. Carter alone on the bench. But as they disappeared into the crowd, something lingered in the air, an unspoken tension that hinted at the storm to come. The boys didn't stop after their first encounter with Mr. Carter. If anything, it only emboldened them. Each visit to the park became an opportunity to torment the homeless man, who continued to sit quietly on his bench, sketching scenes of life around him. "Let's see what masterpiece he's working on today," Dylan sneered one afternoon, leading Jake and Eric toward the bench. Mr. Carter didn't look up, his pencil moving steadily across the page. Dylan leaned over his shoulder and laughed mockingly. "Another sketch of trash? You should sell these. You might make enough for a sandwich." Jake chimed in, grabbing a crumpled soda can from the ground and tossing it at Mr. Carter's feet. "Here, old man, add this to your collection." Eric stood a few steps back, his face a mix of discomfort and guilt. He wanted to say something, but Dylan's intimidating presence kept him silent. As the days turned into weeks, the boys' antics escalated. They would knock over Mr. Carter's few belongings, scatter his sketches, and even take his pencils, laughing as he quietly picked them up. On one occasion, Dylan recorded a video of the group's taunts and posted it online with the caption, "Park Entertainment." It quickly gained views, but instead of sparking outrage, many commenters joined in on the mockery. Despite their relentless bullying, Mr. Carter remained calm. He would simply gather his scattered belongings, straighten his sketches, and return to his seat. His silence wasn't weakness. It was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let their cruelty rob him of his dignity. But his endurance didn't shield him from the pain. At night, when the park emptied and the city lights flickered, he would sit alone, staring at the stars, wondering why kindness seemed so scarce. The bystanders were no better. People walking by would glance at the scene, shake their heads, and continue on their way. A few muttered comments like, "Kids these days," or "someone should do something," but no one stepped in. The park's regulars had grown desensitized to the sight of the boys tormenting Mr. Carter. It was easier to look away than to confront the problem. But karma has a way of catching up, and the boys' actions were setting the stage for consequences they couldn't foresee. One evening, as they surrounded Mr. Carter, a man in a suit watched from a distance. He didn't intervene, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He observed the boys' mocking laughter, the way Mr. Carter calmly picked up his scattered sketches, and the discomfort on Eric's face. The man's expression hardened, and he made a call on his phone before walking away. The first crack in the boy's confidence appeared a few days later. Dylan, who usually strutted through the park with smug arrogance, found himself the subject of whispers at school. A teacher had shown his video to the class as an example of bullying, and while some students laughed, others stared at Dylan with disapproval. "Not so funny now, is it?" someone muttered as he passed by. Eric, meanwhile, could no longer ignore his conscience. Each night as he lay in bed, the image of Mr. Carter gathering his belongings haunted him. He hated what they were doing but didn't know how to break free from Dylan's influence. "What if I'm next?" he thought, the fear paralyzing him. And then there was Jake, whose laughter started to falter as he noticed the man in the suit returning to the park more frequently. Each time the man would exchange a few words with Mr. Carter before walking away. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, but Dylan dismissed his concerns. "Relax," he said. "What's he gonna do? He's just some old guy with a sketch pad." The air in the park grew heavier with tension. The boys began to feel the weight of their actions, though they tried to mask it with bravado. Mr. Carter, meanwhile, continued to sit on his bench, sketching quietly. But now there was a glint in his eyes, a quiet confidence that suggested he knew something they didn't. The stage was set for a reckoning, and the boys' carefree laughter was beginning to sound hollow. Their actions had rippled outward, touching lives in ways they couldn't imagine. And the man in the suit? He wasn't just an observer. He was a catalyst, preparing to tip the scales in a way the boys would never forget. It happened on a day that started like any other. Dylan, Jake, and Eric, met at the park, laughing and planning their next round of antics. Mr. Carter sat on his usual bench, sketching as though the boys weren't there. But today, the air felt different, heavier, as if something unseen was stirring. The boys approached, ready to repeat their usual taunts. Dylan leaned in, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still dreaming, old man? What's the masterpiece today?" But before Mr. Carter could respond, a voice interrupted. "What are you boys doing?" The man in the suit had returned, stepping out from the shadows with a commanding presence. The boys froze, caught off guard. Dylan quickly recovered, his tone dismissive. "Just talking to our friend here," he said with a forced grin. The man's sharp gaze pinned him in place. "I've been watching you for weeks," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "You've been bullying this man relentlessly. Do you even know who he is?" The boys exchanged uneasy glances. Dylan scoffed, trying to regain control. "What's to know? He's just some homeless guy." The man in the suit crossed his arms. "His name is Robert Carter, and he's a former architect who designed half the buildings in this city. The only reason he's here is because he gave everything he had to save his family from financial ruin after a tragedy." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jake's jaw dropped, and even Dylan faltered, his bravado slipping. Eric looked down, ashamed. "You've been mocking a man who's contributed more to this city than you can imagine," the man continued. "And the video you posted online? It's already making its rounds, but not in the way you think." The man held up his phone, showing a local news article with the headline, "Bullied but not broken, the story of Robert Carter." The video Dylan had posted had gone viral, but instead of ridicule, it had sparked outrage. People were rallying behind Mr. Carter, condemning the boy's actions. Dylan's face turned pale. I didn't mean," he stammered, but the man cut him off. "It's too late for excuses. Actions have consequences." The boys were left standing in stunned silence as the man walked away, leaving them to grapple with their actions. Jake was the first to speak, his voice shaky. "I didn't know. I thought it was just a joke." Eric shook his head, his voice heavy with regret. "It was never a joke, Jake. We were wrong about all of it." For the first time, Dylan had no snarky comeback. His mind replayed every cruel word, every mocking laugh, and the silent endurance of the man they had tormented. The weight of guilt settled over him, suffocating and inescapable. Later that night, Eric sat alone in his room, scrolling through the comments on the news article. The overwhelming support for Mr. Carter made him feel even smaller. "How did we miss this?" he whispered to himself. "How did we let it go so far?" He knew he had to make amends. But the question was how. The next day, the boys returned to the park, but this time there was no laughter, no taunts. They approached Mr. Carter cautiously, their steps hesitant. Dylan was the first to speak. We didn't know," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "about who you are, what you've been through. We were wrong." Mr. Carter looked up from his sketch, his eyes meeting Dylan's. For a moment there was only silence. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect. That's where you went wrong." The words hit hard, but they weren't meant to wound. They were a lesson, one the boys couldn't ignore. "We're sorry," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric nodded, his eyes glistening. "Is there any way we can make it right?" Mr. Carter considered their words for a moment before nodding. "You can start by learning from this. Help others instead of tearing them down. And remember, kindness doesn't cost a thing." The boys took Mr. Carter's advice to heart. They began volunteering at local shelters, helping people who had faced hardships like his. They even organized a fundraiser to support Mr. Carter's dream of reopening an art studio where he could teach and inspire others. Mr. Carter, for his part, didn't dwell on the past. He poured his energy into his sketches, many of which now reflected themes of resilience and redemption. One day, as he stood in the park, surrounded by children learning to sketch, he smiled. The darkness had lifted, replaced by something brighter. And the boys? They weren't the same either. Dylan's confidence had shifted from arrogance to humility. Jake found joy in helping others, and Eric discovered a passion for advocacy, using his voice to stand up for those who couldn't. The turning point wasn't just for them, it was for everyone involved. And it all began with the quiet strength of a man who refused to let cruelty define him. The aftermath of their actions rippled through the boys' lives like a storm, leaving nothing unchanged. Dylan, Jake, and Eric found themselves at the center of public scrutiny as their video and the story of Mr. Carter spread like wildfire. The community, once indifferent to their antics, was now united in outrage. For Dylan, the fallout was swift and harsh. His teachers confronted him in front of the class, using his actions as a cautionary tale about bullying and respect. At first, Dylan tried to brush it off, but the stares and whispered judgments from his classmates cut deeper than he expected. His social media accounts were flooded with criticism, forcing him to deactivate them. The confident leader of the group was now isolated and defensive, struggling to come to terms with the magnitude of his mistakes. Jake faced a different kind of consequence. His parents, who had seen the video on the news, were furious. They grounded him indefinitely, taking away his phone and privileges. But more than the punishment, Jake was haunted by the look of disappointment on his mother's face. "We didn't raise you to be this way," she said, her voice trembling. Her words replayed in his mind, each repetition weighing heavier on his conscience. Eric, already burdened by guilt, took it upon himself to report to the school counselor. "I need to make this right," he said during their first meeting. He confessed everything, the bullying, his silence, and his regret. The counselor encouraged him to channel his remorse into action, suggesting he help with community service projects as a way to atone. Eric eagerly agreed, hoping to find redemption. As the days turned into weeks, each boy began to process the events differently. Dylan, stripped of his social power, was forced to confront his insecurities. He realized that his bravado had been a shield, hiding his own fears of rejection and inadequacy. For the first time in his life, he started listening more than talking, trying to understand the impact of his behavior. Jake, under the watchful eyes of his parents, began to see the world beyond his narrow perspective. His parents took him to volunteer at a homeless shelter, where he met people with stories not unlike Mr. Carter's. One evening, as he served food to a man who had lost his job and home, Jake felt a pang of understanding. "I'm sorry for how I've judged people," he said softly to his parents on the drive home. Eric's transformation was the most profound. He became an advocate against bullying at school, organizing workshops and speaking to younger students about kindness and empathy. "I used to think standing by was enough," he told a group of freshmen one afternoon. "But silence is just another form of cruelty. We all have a responsibility to do better." Meanwhile, Mr. Carter watched the events unfold with quiet dignity. He had seen the news coverage, the apologies, and the boys' attempts to make amends. When the boys returned to the park one day, visibly nervous, he greeted them with the same calm demeanor he always had. "We wanted to say we're sorry," Eric began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Dylan and Jake nodded, their expressions sincere. "We know we can't undo what we did, but we're trying to make things right." Mr. Carter studied them for a moment before speaking. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," he said. "It's about choosing to move forward. I forgive you, but remember, every choice you make leaves a mark on you and on others. Make sure the marks you leave are ones you can be proud of." The boys nodded, their gratitude evident. For them, his words were both a comfort and a challenge, a reminder that their journey toward redemption had only just begun. the story didn't end with the boys. Inspired by Mr. Carter's resilience and the boys' transformation, the community rallied to support local homeless initiatives. Fundraisers, food drives, and volunteer programs became regular events, creating a ripple effect of kindness that extended far beyond the park. Mr. Carter became a symbol of strength and grace, his sketches now displayed in local galleries and sold to benefit homelessness awareness programs. He found a renewed sense of purpose, teaching art classes to children and adults alike. Art, he often said, is a way to turn pain into beauty, to tell the stories that matter. For Dylan, Jake, and Eric, the experience left an indelible mark. They carried Mr. Carter's lessons with them, striving to be better, not just for themselves, but for the world around them. And in the quiet corners of their lives, they often thought of the man who had changed their perspectives forever. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. Mr. Carter sat on his usual bench, sketchpad in hand, as the boys approached cautiously. Dylan walked a few steps ahead of Jake and Eric, his face set with determination, but tinged with uncertainty. This was the moment they had been dreading and anticipating, a chance to confront the man they had wronged. "Mr. Carter," Dylan began, his voice steady but low, "we need to talk." Mr. Carter looked up from his sketch, his expression calm but unreadable. He set the pencil down carefully and gestured for them to sit. The boys hesitated before settling onto the bench across from him. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the rustling leaves. "We're sorry," Dylan said finally, the words thick with emotion, "for everything, for the things we said, the way we treated you. We didn't understand." "No, you didn't," Mr. Carter replied, his tone neither angry nor forgiving, just matter of fact. "But understanding doesn't erase the harm you caused, it only begins to fix it." Jake leaned forward, his voice cracking. "We've been trying to make up for it, volunteering, helping others, but it doesn't feel like enough." Mr. Carter studied them, his gaze sharp, but not unkind. "It's not about erasing what's been done," he said. "It's about changing who you are moving forward. Do you understand that?" Eric nodded, his eyes glistening. "We do, and we'll keep trying." Mr. Carter leaned back, his expression softening. "Good," he said simply, "but you don't need my forgiveness to do what's right. Forgiveness is a gift, not a guarantee. You'll have to earn it, not from me, but from yourselves." The boys sat quietly, absorbing his words. Dylan, who had always been the leader, now found himself humbled. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for even listening to us." Mr. Carter nodded and picked up his pencil. "I listened because I saw something in you that you didn't see in yourselves," he said. "Potential. Don't waste it." As the boys stood to leave, a sense of weight lifted from their shoulders. They weren't absolved of their past actions, but they had a path forward, a way to make things right, not just for Mr. Carter but for the world around them. From his bench, Mr. Carter watched them walk away. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his heart. Hope. Hope that even the worst actions could lead to better futures, and that change was always possible. The weeks that followed their confrontation with Mr. Carter brought a quiet transformation in the boys' lives. Dylan, once the ringleader of their cruel antics, found himself drawn to quieter pursuits. He joined a community theater group, where he channeled his energy into storytelling and creative expression. The experience taught him empathy, as he learned to step into the shoes of different characters and understand their struggles. Jake became a familiar face at the local shelter, volunteering every weekend. He developed friendships with the people he met there, each of their stories reminding him of Mr. Carter's resilience. One day, as he handed a warm meal to a man who reminded him of Mr. Carter, Jake realized he had found purpose in service. Eric's advocacy efforts at school gained traction. He worked with teachers and administrators to create an anti-bullying program, sharing his own story as a way to inspire change. His peers began to see him not as the quiet bystander he once was, but as a leader with a heart for justice. And Mr. Carter, he found a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. His sketches, now celebrated by the community, were displayed in galleries and sold to support local homeless initiatives. Each time he sat on his bench with his sketchpad, he felt not the weight of the past, but the hope of the future.
Kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything, Mr. Carter would say to the children who attended his art classes in the park. His words became a mantra for those who had once walked past him without a second glance. As the boys and Mr. Carter crossed paths occasionally, their interactions were marked by mutual respect. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of how far they had come. This story is a testament to the power of kindness and the lessons we can learn from our mistakes, the narrator concludes. Remember, kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything. Let's choose to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe for more impactful tales. Your support helps us share stories that matter and inspire change. Kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything.